You could have paid this tax without blinking, a penny on a newspaper, a shilling on a deck of cards. Most colonists could have afforded it. They went to war over it anyway. This little seal, the Stamp Act, pressed into their paper in 1765, started a 10-year countdown. At the end of it, a British army was standing on an American street, not the war. The 10 years before it, the year's attacks on paper taught the colonies how to say one word to the most powerful empire on earth. No. Follow the money. Britain had just won a war and couldn't pay for it. In 1763, it beat France and took half a continent. But the victory came with a crushing debt and roughly twice the land to defend. Parliament, sitting 3,000 miles away, looked across the ocean and decided the colonies could help cover the bill. First, it drew a line down the mountains and told the colonists they couldn't settle the land they'd just fought for. Then, it taxed their sugar. They grumbled. They paid. Then, it went after the paper. And the paper was different. This tax didn't wait at the dock for goods coming off a ship. It reached inside the colony and taxed the documents of ordinary life. A land deed, a newspaper, a marriage license, a ship's clearance, a college diploma, a deck of cards. Roughly 50 kinds of paper, each one needing a stamp you had to buy from the crown. And what made people furious wasn't the cost. It was simpler than that, and bigger. No colonist had voted for this. Not one of them had a single voice in the parliament that passed it. A body of men across an ocean had reached into their newspapers, their courts, their card games, and they'd had no say at all. So a backcountry lawyer stood up and said so out loud. His name was Patrick Henry, and the men in that chamber thought he had no business being there. He'd failed as a storekeeper, failed as a farmer, gone bankrupt twice. Then he'd taught himself just enough law to scrape past the bar, and somehow gotten himself elected to Virginia's House of Burgesses, a room full of polished Tidewater gentlemen who looked at him like he'd wandered in from the woods. He stood up anyway, and he reminded them of kings, Caesar, Charles I, struck down by the people they ruled. The point about King George was loud enough that the room erupted, the speaker himself shouting that this was treason. He didn't say it as cleanly as the legend claims, but he didn't take it back either, and the colony's newspapers printed his resolves, every one of them, north and south. The argument was no longer in one man's head. It was on every front page, and it was about to leave the page entirely. This is why pennies were worth a fight. The moment you pay the stamp, you've admitted they had the right to charge it. The penny was a confession, and the colonists weren't going to sign it. In Boston, they made sure no one could. One August morning, a dummy was found hanging from a great elm, a figure of Andrew Oliver, the man Britain had picked to sell the stamps in Massachusetts. By nightfall, a crowd had torn down the building they took for his stamp office and broken every window in his house. They never laid a hand on Oliver himself. They didn't have to. The next day, he resigned. Months later, they dragged him back out into the December cold to swear it again in public, under that same tree, so the whole town could watch. And here's what it bought them. By the day the Stamp Act was supposed to take effect, there wasn't one man left in all 13 colonies willing to sell a single stamp. The law arrived already dead. None of that was an accident. The crowd had organizers. In a Boston back room, 9 tradesmen, a printer, a distiller, shopkeepers, had been quietly planning it. They became the Sons of Liberty, and the name traveled faster than they did. That October in New York, 27 men from 9 different colonies sat down in a single room, and that had never happened before. Colonies that competed, that distrusted each other, that shared almost nothing. Together they wrote one petition, in one voice. They were careful with it. They swore they were loyal subjects, devoted to the king. They weren't asking to leave. They were asking for the rights they believed every Englishman already had. It wasn't a nation, but 13 separate places had just discovered they had one enemy in common, and they could feel it. And then Britain did something that almost worked. In March of 1766, Parliament gave in. It repealed the Stamp Act. The colonies went wild. Bells rang in Boston. Bonfires burned. Men stood in the streets and toasted the king. They had pushed back against the most powerful empire on earth, and they had won. They didn't read the second law. Because on the very same day Parliament killed the stamp tax, in the same session, it passed another act, quietly. It declared that Parliament held the full right to make laws binding the colonies, in its own words, in all cases whatsoever. Listen to it again. In all cases whatsoever. Britain hadn't backed down. It had given up one tax and kept the entire principle, the exact thing the whole fight had been about. The colonists were toasting a victory they'd already lost. They just didn't know it yet. They'd find out in about a year. In 1767, Parliament used exactly the right it had just claimed. New taxes, this time on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. This time the colonies didn't burn anything. They simply stopped buying. Merchants signed written agreements not to import a single taxed British good. Anyone who refused to sign had his name printed in the papers for the whole town to read. And the Sons of Liberty made sure a shop that broke ranks didn't stay in business long. It was quieter than a riot. It was also harder to fight. The colonies had learned to refuse without a torch, and they were squeezing. So the Crown sent something to Boston that turned an argument into an occupation. In June of 1768, customs officers seized a ship. It belonged to John Hancock, the richest merchant in Boston, and seizing his sloop, the Liberty, in his own harbor was meant as a message. Within hours, a crowd 3,000 strong had filled the waterfront. They beat the customs officers. They didn't kill anyone, but they chased those men in fear of their lives. And then the crowd did something almost too perfect. They couldn't reach Hancock's ship. It had been towed out under the guns of a warship. So they grabbed the customs collector's own private pleasure boat off the dock, carried it through the streets, and burned it to ashes on Boston Common. The Crown's officials in Boston fled to an island fort in the harbor, and from out there, safe, they sent London a single demand: they would not come back to do their jobs without an army to protect them. London sent the army. On the 1st of October 1768 at noon, 2,000 British regulars stepped off their ships onto Long Wharf. 2 full regiments, with artillery, formed up in the street of a British city and marched to camp on Boston Common, the town's own common ground. Boston was a British town. These were British soldiers. They had been sent to occupy their own countrymen. Now go back to where we started. A penny on a newspaper, a shilling on a deck of cards, a tax so small you could pay it without blinking. 3 years of saying no, and there it was. Boots on the cobblestones, tents on the common, muskets in a city that used to call itself loyal. The fuse was lit. It would burn for years before anything caught. But put soldiers and the people they're watching on the same narrow streets, day after day, and the distance between them gets very thin. Every shove becomes an incident. Every insult waits for an answer. An army sent to keep the peace becomes the thing the town can't stop staring at. It only takes one cold night. One crowd, one soldier who doesn't know whether the order he just heard was fire. For now, in the fall of 1768, the paper tax is gone, the principle behind it is alive, and there's a British army living on Boston Common, waiting for a town that has already learned, completely, how to say no. For more big stories told small, like and subscribe to Mainstreet Miniatures.